has done great things. He has done great things. Oh, hero of heaven, you conquered the grave. You free every captive and break every chain. Oh God, you have done great things. We dance in your freedom, awake and alive. Oh Jesus, our Savior, your name lifted high. Oh God, you have done great things.
It's always good to get the thanks at the beginning, isn't it? I want to talk to you about moving at the speed of God. Moving at the speed of God. And I want to use two examples. One of them is from 1 Kings 19. And that's the story of Elijah fleeing from the wrath of Jezebel. And the other is about Mary and Martha and the rising of Lazarus from the dead. So that's John 11. Elijah flees Jezebel. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." She wasn't hanging about, was she? Then he was afraid, and he rose and ran for his life, and he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die. "It's enough now, O Lord, take my life away, for I'm no better than my fathers." And he lay down and he slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, and there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and he drank and he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time, touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose, he ate and he drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, to the Mount of God. And he came to a cave, and he lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the low sound of a whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak. He went out and he stood at the entrance of the cave, and behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah was terrified of Jezebel. I don't know if you know the story, but anyway, Ahab was king of the northern region, the king of Israel. And Asa was on the throne of the south, Judah. Ahab married Jezebel. And Jezebel had her own gods. Baal was a god that she worshipped in particular. And Ahab took on that worship with her and began to worship Baal. And so on top of Mount Carmel, there was this huge test of who was the best God, who was the only God, really. And so the prophets of Baal raised an altar. And Elijah said, get Baal to call fire down onto this altar and burn your sacrifice. And then we'll know that Baal is a great God. Anyway, they couldn't. And they went round and round this altar, and singing and shouting all day, and they were cutting themselves and all kinds of things, and nothing happened. And then Elijah more or less said, right, watch this. And so he prepared a sacrifice on an altar and called down the Lord God, who burned that sacrifice, who made that sacrifice holy. And he poured water and everything onto the altar, and he just tried to show them that it doesn't matter what we put in the way of God, God will do what God will do. And his God, our God, is the only God. The prophets of Baal were destroyed after that by the people of Israel, and Jezebel was really upset at her prophets. And so she said, may God deal with me ever so severely if I don't do to you what you've just done to my prophets. And Elijah legged it. He was terrified. He was terrified. And he ran to the place where he thought God would be. And that Horeb was the place where God dwelt. And if you read the Old Testament, if you read Exodus in particular, you will see that this God is the God of fire, the God of the earthquake, the God of the great cloud that came down upon the tabernacle. The great and mighty God was a sort of physical entity as well to the people of Israel. Perhaps we don't see God in that way now. But this is how Elijah saw him, as a physical presence. He just seen the fire come down onto the altar. A physical presence. And so he ran to the place where he thought God would be. This holy mountain. Where the Israelites, the Jewish people, believed God dwelt. And he got there. He got there. And he sat down. And he experienced an earthquake. And he experienced wind, and he experienced fire, but he didn't experience God. The place that he thought God would be, in the way that he thought God would present himself to Elijah, didn't happen. There was nothing there. And then all of a sudden, as he sat in his cave, bereft and afraid, and wanting to die, he hears a whisper. Now, the translation for that is a small silent voice. Hang on, I've just gone out of my head. A thin, small voice of silence. That's how it's translated. He hears a thin, small voice of silence. And it's that sort of nothing thing going round inside you where you think you've heard something, but you're not sure you've heard something. It's just thin and quiet. And so silent that it's almost not there. In Hebrew, I am who I am, when God says that, it's and it's almost like that whisper. God whispers into his heart. And he wraps his cloak around his head. And he goes outside. And he hears God. What are you doing here, Elijah? And suddenly, he's in step with God. He's found that place where God is in his life. And he realizes that what's gone on behind him is past. The destruction of the prophets of Baal. That great moment of height and triumph on Mount Carmel. It's gone, it's behind him. It's not there any longer. That was something that happened in the past. And he knows too that when he says, I'm so fed up, I just want to die. When he looks to the future and doesn't see a future, he knows that God is not in his death either. And that understanding drops from his head into his heart. And finally, after all this trial and tribulation, he comes to the place where God is and where God can act. Moving forward into the New Testament, to John chapter 11, we see the story of Martha and Mary and Lazarus. And Martha sends a message to Jesus, and she says, your servant Lazarus is ill. Please come. And Jesus doesn't come. Not for 3 days. And then when he turns up, Lazarus is dead. And in her mind, God has come too late to do anything. And it's a beautiful story if you read it. I won't read it out again for you. But if you want to read it as I'm talking to you, John chapter 11. And you'll see the story there. And you can just tell by reading the story that this is painful for Martha and for Mary. And the reason it's painful is because they love Jesus. They love Jesus. And this man who they thought would come immediately because they thought he loved them and Lazarus doesn't turn up, doesn't come. And she goes out to meet him first. Martha goes out first to meet him. And there's a sort of rebuke there, isn't there, in the story. And she goes to him and she says, Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. If you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. But she loves Jesus. And she says, but even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. I know that. And Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. And she says, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection of the last day. Now, to see what's going on there with Martha. She says, you know what? If you'd have been here a bit of time, a little bit of time ago, I know that my brother would still be alive now. So she looks back to the time when she thought Jesus should act or could act. And she's looking back to a time when she must have been also thinking, look at all these other people that he's healed. Look at all the other people that he's been with. People touch him in a crowd and he stops and looks after them. A blind man sits at the roadside shouting, and above the shout of the crowd and everybody that's crowding around him, he hears the blind man, and he goes to the blind man and he heals the blind man, blind Bartimaeus. And there's a man sat by a spring, a healing spring in Jerusalem, who don't ask him anything, but Jesus goes up to him and says, don't you want to be healed? And yet Lazarus, who he spent time with and ate with and spoken to and encouraged, to the point where Mary, Martha and Lazarus are completely taken up in this following of Jesus. He can't even bother coming to see him when he's ill, and now it's too late. She looks back at a time when she thought God should have acted. And then when Jesus said, your brother will rise again, she doesn't take that to mean now. She thinks that's impossible. Lazarus is dead. And so she says, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection of the last day. So she looks forward then to a place where God is and God will be. And I know we talk about the eternal presence of God. And we're all living in the eternal presence of God now. But quite often our minds aren't. Our minds are either looking forward to somewhere over the rainbow where everything's going to be all right again, or it's looking to past times where God acted, or where we sense God's presence in a real way that changed our lives. But Jesus keeps dragging her back. This is where you need to be, here and now. And it was the same for his sister who read the story. But it's only when we're pulled into the presence of God now that we can see God acting. Where God suddenly changes our life in a remarkable way. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story, I suppose, is because of this Gerald Coates thing as well. Where many of us hark back to a time when church was brilliant. I'm not saying it's not brilliant now, it's been great this morning. But I'm on about the wider church now. We'll talk about, in Wales, we'll talk about revival that happened at the start of the last century. And we'll talk about that as if that was the last time God was here. And what we want actually is God to come back to that place again, but he's not here yet, so we've got to look forward somewhere over the rainbow and keep praying, and God will come back in that way. But I would say to you that God is acting now and always now. And we as congregations of Christians that come together in the belief in a risen Lord need to come together and speak of a risen Lord that acts now. Because it is only in the now that Lazarus rises from the dead. Jesus keeps his promise. When he says, I'll be with you always, even to the end of the age. He doesn't mean I'll be somewhere around if you look for me. What he means is he'll be with us always until the end of the age. We just celebrated Ascension in the church in Lomas on Thursday. We celebrated Ascension Day where Jesus is taken up into heaven. And he was taken up, and he tells us, I go now, not so you get less, so that you get more. So there's not just me, 5'10" or 6 foot high and a couple of feet wide. It's not just me, but it is more of me. You get more of me by me being in the place I need to be. Back with my Father. You get more of me with his Spirit by me ascending. And so we live in this eternal presence of God. And yet we're forever harking back or looking forward. I believe with all my heart that the tide is coming in. I believe in things that are almost unbelievable. That are unbelievable to people that don't know Jesus. Very strange thing happened to me in the car. And I'm not saying, you just listen to the story. So my car's like a tip. Yeah? And it always is. And what happens is I go somewhere, somebody gives me a bit of paper, I throw it over the back seat. I go to somebody gives me and I throw it over the back seat. And so the back seat just becomes a paper file, really. I have no idea what's in there anyway. So me and Jan were back home up in North Wales. And it must have been about a year ago. And Jan says to me, she says, the usual thing, we're driving somewhere and it gives her time to have a look around the car. She said, your car is a tip. And so we get it, yeah, it's my car though, so it's my tip, so just sit there yourself. She pulls a piece of paper over her shoulder, and it's all very posh in the church events, and it's the enthronement, where I'm enthroned. In other words, I've got my own seat. So when I go into the cathedral, I've got my own seat. I bet you've got your own seat. It's funny you sat there, isn't it? It's no different. It's just very official. Here's your seat, and it looks like a shower cubicle. It's up at the top on the right hand side, and so I get this seat. It's called the enthronement. So there's a service there to give me this seat. And she said, look, she says, what are you doing with this? She says, this is the enthronement service. And I said, well, just put it back on the back seat. It doesn't matter. I said, I didn't know it was there. I've just put it in the back seat. And before this, in the morning, before we were going shopping, I was sitting and I got into a ridiculous conversation with God. So you remember Abraham, and Abraham was talking about people in Gomorrah. If there are just, I can't remember the numbers exactly now, but say, if there's just 70 people that are still people that are following God, would you destroy it then? Gomorrah? No, I won't destroy that. But what if it's 35? No, I won't destroy that. Well, what if it's 10? Well, I won't destroy that. And he's getting dafter and dafter and dafter, Abraham. And he's saying, forgive me for asking you again, but just say, and what Abraham wanted to know was, look, exactly how many people need to be left in Gomorrah before you destroy it, God? But he was going down this list, lower and lower and lower numbers. And I was going up the list in my mind. And I said, God, would it be? Because we're in crisis as well in this Swansea bracket in the church. Lots of people left after COVID and never came back. And so I said, would it be too much to ask that somehow, over this next few years, we could double in size? Nothing, heard nothing. And then I started getting silly. Well, what if it quadrupled in size? That'd be brilliant, wouldn't it? Nothing. But I kept going, and I got to 10 and thought, you've been stupid now, John, just read something else. What if it was 10 times bigger over this next period? 0, nothing. Time to stop being stupid. So I read something else, I got in the car. And I was looking, you know, you never get healing out of you really. I'm still looking for signs that, you know, a sign that might say something about how big we might be able to grow, how many people might be able to come to faith if we were faithful too. So I'm looking at nothing. So we have the argument in the car, my car's a tip, I know my car's a tip. Pull it out, here's the enthronement. And we're just pulling into the shops, and she looked at me, and she had no idea of this conversation, it had all been in her head. And she said, She says, did you know that you were the 10th Bishop of Swansea and Brecon? She said to me. I'll start crying. And I'm pulling into the parking slot. And I said, no, I had no idea. And I thought, oh, and the hair on the back of my neck came up. And then she just looked at me. As I said, she had no idea about this conversation. And she just looked at me. She says, something funny about the number 10, isn't there? She said to me. And suddenly we were sat in a moment where I felt God was challenging me. As if God was saying to me, look, if you can be daft, I can be daft too. How daft do you want to be, John? And I thought, in that respect, very daft. I just want more and more and more people to get to know the Jesus that I love, but more importantly, who loves me. The Jesus who says, I'm never going to leave you nor forsake you. I'm always going to be with you. The Jesus that says, I know when you stand up and when you sit down. I know your thoughts from afar. I'm forever about your paths and the places where you rest. There's not a thought in your mind that I don't know already. I'm with a God who says, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. I want to be with a God who says, I know you're young, and I know you think you can't do the things that I have asked you to do. And some of them might seem ridiculous to you, but I want you to do them anyway. I want to be with that God. And I want to live in that moment. And I want to know the eternal presence of God every moment that my mind can possibly tune into that. And I never want to get to the stage, although I feel sometimes I have been, the stage where Elijah says, oh, it was great in the past, but you know what, I've had it now, I'm done. I just wish I could die, put it all behind me. It's all too difficult. And I never want to be at that moment where I experience pain, but I feel that even God can't do anything about it. Even God can't do anything about it at that moment. And somehow, me and God have got to sit down together until the moment's right. I never want to be at that point in my ministry either. I was going to retire this Christmas just gone. And me and Jan had set everything up to go. So we've got a house in Somerset, it's only a little thing, 2 up, 2 down. People say to me, what have you achieved in your life? When I was in Ashton, we lived in a 2 up, 2 down with a backyard and an outside toilet and a bath on the wall. The house in Somerset has got an inside toilet and a bathroom. And I always say to people when they say, what do you feel you've achieved? I always say, I've managed to move an outside toilet and a bath 30 yards. And it's so much more convenient. And I feel fulfilled in my life. But I was thinking it was time to finish. And I wasn't thinking I want to die. But I was thinking, you know what, I've been shoving this stone uphill for 30 years now, and I've had enough. It's time to lay down. And somehow, God gave me the strength to carry on for a few more years. And God was able to say to me, nah, don't finish. Let's just crack on for a bit. And I was able, in that moment, to hear that still, small whisper, that thin voice of silence. God saying to me, I am who I am, and so are you. Let's journey together. So I have a message for any church, for any gathering of Christians, whoever you might be and wherever you might be. I would say to you, remember God is faithful. Not just in the past. And remember that God is not just faithful somewhere in the future, but God is faithful now, in this moment, at this time. And if you can live, if we can live in this moment and move at the same speed that God moves, we will feel more fulfilled than we've ever felt. And we will truly be the people of God. The people that God intends us to be. If, however hard it might be, we can live in his moments.